able to right now. That was cool. I can't believe I did that. What the heck? I'm not able to right now. That was cool.
Blood and betrayal have always been the twin currencies of the Chicago underworld. But Dominic Rossi never expected the fatal blade to come from the very woman sharing his bed. For 8 agonizing months, the ruthless syndicate head had been helplessly watching his world dissolve into a terrifying, impenetrable grey fog. The best specialists money could buy called it a rare, aggressively irreversible optical decay. He was quietly resigning himself to a life of shadows, slowly handing over the bloody reins of his empire, until a 7-year-old girl slipped past his heavily armed guards, tugged on his tailored suit sleeve, and whispered the exact words that would ignite a massacre. "You're not blind. Your wife is spiking your food." Dominic Rossi was not a man who believed in the concept of vulnerability. At 34, he was the undisputed head of the Rossi Syndicate, an organization that held the city of Chicago in a suffocating, velvet-gloved grip. His name commanded respect in the high-rises of the financial district and instilled absolute terror in the grimy alleyways of the ports. He was a man carved from Sicilian marble and cold American ambition. He had survived assassination attempts, federal indictments, and brutal turf wars. Yet nothing could have prepared him for the insidious enemy that bypassed his security detail and attacked him from within his own body. It started exactly 8 months ago as a subtle blurring at the edges of his vision. At first, Dominic dismissed it as simple fatigue. He was working 19-hour days, managing illegal shipping routes, laundering millions through real estate, and keeping the rival factions at bay. He assumed the stinging in his eyes was merely the cost of his relentless ambition. But the blurriness did not retreat with rest. It advanced. The sharp lines of his mahogany desk began to soften. The faces of his capos, men he needed to read for the slightest twitch of deception, became smudged and indistinct. Panic, a wholly foreign emotion to the Mafia boss, began to take root in his chest. Dominic secretly flew in the most renowned ophthalmologists and neurologists from Switzerland and Johns Hopkins, paying them exorbitant sums in unmarked cash to keep his condition off any official record. A blind Don is a dead Don. Weakness in his world was an open invitation to a coup. The doctors ran countless tests, drew vials of his blood, scanned his brain, and stared into his dilating pupils. Their unanimous, grim conclusion was a devastating blow, a rapid-onset degenerative condition affecting his optic nerves. There was no cure. The progression would be swift. Within a year, he would be completely enveloped in darkness. As the physical light faded, Dominic's world shrank to the sprawling, hyper-secure perimeters of his Lake Forest estate. He relied increasingly on his other senses. He learned the exact number of steps from his leather armchair to the liquor cabinet. He learned to identify his men not by their faces, but by the heavy scent of their cologne, the distinct cadence of their footsteps, or the subtle wheeze in their breathing. Through this descending nightmare, his only anchor was Beatrice. Beatrice Rossi was a vision of high society elegance, a woman who had married into the mob with her eyes wide open, but maintained the pristine aura of an untouchable socialite. When Dominic first met her, she was a ruthless art dealer with a mind as sharp as a diamond and a smile that could disarm a loaded weapon. Now, she played the role of the devoted, grief-stricken wife with flawless execution. She was always by his side, her soft hands guiding him through the mansion, her soothing voice reading him the daily ledgers, her expensive floral perfume the only constant comfort in his darkening universe. Every evening, at exactly 8 o'clock, Beatrice would personally brew his espresso. It was a ritual they had shared since their honeymoon in Palermo. She would bring the steaming porcelain cup to his study, pressing a tender kiss to his temple, whispering words of encouragement. "Drink, my love," Beatrice would say, her voice dripping with artificial honey. "You need your strength. The doctors said the new supplements will help slow the decay. We will fight this together, Dominic. I am right here." Dominic would drink the bitter espresso, swallowing the metallic-tasting supplements she faithfully administered, blindly trusting the woman who held his heart. He did not know that with every sip, he was drinking his own demise. He did not know that his trusted underboss, a calculating and ruthless man named Silas, was a frequent, unrecorded visitor to Beatrice's private chambers when Dominic was confined to his study. The Don of Chicago was completely blind to the fact that his optical decay was not an act of God, but a meticulous, slow-drip poisoning orchestrated by the two people he trusted most in the world. They were methodically destroying his vision with a rare, untraceable neurotoxin, preparing to stage a seamless transfer of power once Dominic was deemed physically incapable of ruling. They were stealing his empire, his sight, and his life, all while wrapping him in the warm embrace of false devotion. While the adults played their deadly high-stakes games of power and deception, the sprawling Rossi estate was home to a ghost. Her name was Clara. Clara was 7 years old, a tiny, quiet girl with large, watchful eyes and a mop of unruly dark hair. She was the only child of Arthur, Dominic's most loyal and longest-serving bodyguard. 2 years ago, Arthur had taken a sniper's bullet that was meant for Dominic's chest. As Arthur lay dying on the cold concrete of a warehouse floor, Dominic had knelt in the pooling blood, gripping his friend's hand, and sworn an oath on his mother's grave that he would protect and provide for Clara forever. Dominic had kept that promise. Clara was moved into a lavish wing of the estate. She had the best tutors, a wardrobe fit for a princess, and an army of guards tasked with her safety. However, with Dominic's rapidly declining health and his increasing isolation, Clara was largely left to her own devices. She became part of the architecture, a silent, invisible presence that the adults simply forgot to notice. In a house filled with criminals, killers, and conspirators, Clara learned early on that invisibility was her greatest superpower. She knew the secret passages behind the library bookshelves. She knew exactly which floorboards in the grand hallway creaked and how to step precisely over them. She spent her days observing the strange, frightening world of the Mafia from the shadows. Clara possessed an intelligence and intuition far beyond her 7 years. She idolized Uncle Dom. To the world, he was a monster. To Clara, he was the giant who used to hoist her onto his shoulders, the man who brought her rare chocolates from Europe, the father figure who had cried at her own father's funeral. Lately, Clara had noticed a terrifying change in Uncle Dom. He stumbled over rugs. He stared blankly at walls. He no longer read her the bedtime stories about knights and dragons, instead asking her to describe the pictures to him. It broke her heart. But Clara noticed other things, too. Things the adults thought were hidden. She noticed that Beatrice's smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at Dominic. She noticed the way Beatrice's voice changed, becoming cold, sharp, and commanding, the moment she stepped out of Dominic's study and closed the heavy oak doors. More importantly, Clara noticed Silas. Silas was a tall, imposing man with slicked-back hair and a constant, cruel smirk. He was supposed to be Dominic's right hand, running the streets while the Don rested. But Clara saw how Silas looked at Beatrice when Dominic wasn't in the room. It was a hungry, possessive look. She saw them whispering in the dimly lit corridors, their bodies pressed far too close together for mere business associates. The true revelation, however, came on a rainy Tuesday evening. Clara was playing hide-and-seek with the estate's massive mastiff, Brutus. She had wedged herself into the small pantry adjacent to the main kitchen, hiding behind a row of imported olive oil tins. Through the crack in the pantry door, she watched Beatrice enter the kitchen. The staff had already been dismissed for the night. Beatrice was alone, preparing Dominic's 8 o'clock espresso. Clara held her breath, watching with wide-eyed curiosity as Beatrice pulled a small, unmarked glass vial from the deep pocket of her silk dressing gown. Beatrice did not reach for the usual vitamin supplements she claimed to give Dominic. Instead, she used a tiny silver dropper to extract a clear, odorless liquid from the vial. Beatrice's face was a mask of cold concentration. She squeezed exactly 4 drops of the liquid into the steaming cup of dark espresso. She then took a silver spoon and stirred it carefully, ensuring the poison was completely dissolved. "Just a little longer, old man," Beatrice murmured to herself, her voice a chilling whisper that carried perfectly to Clara's hiding spot. "A few more weeks of this, and Silas will have the board's full backing. You won't even see the knife coming." Clara pressed her small hands over her mouth to muffle a gasp. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't understand the complex politics of the syndicate or the medical terminology of Dominic's condition, but she understood one absolute truth. Beatrice was hurting Uncle Dom. The medicine wasn't medicine at all. It was poison. The beautiful, elegant wife was the monster in the castle. For 3 days, Clara carried this heavy, terrifying secret. She was paralyzed by fear. Beatrice was powerful, terrifying, and always surrounded by loyal guards. If Clara told a maid or a capo, word would surely get back to Beatrice, and Clara knew instinctively that she would be silenced forever. She had to tell the one person who could stop it. She had to tell Uncle Dom, but she had to do it without Beatrice knowing. The opportunity presented itself on the night of the annual Rossi Syndicate Gala. It was a massive, opulent affair held on the ground floor of the estate, designed to project an image of absolute strength and unshakable wealth to the rival families and corrupt politicians of Chicago. Dominic was seated in a high-backed velvet chair in the corner of the grand ballroom, surrounded by a phalanx of bodyguards. He looked regal, dressed in a custom charcoal grey tuxedo, but the blank, unfocused stare of his eyes betrayed his vulnerability. He was trapped in a sensory overload of clinking champagne flutes, booming laughter, and a string quartet playing Mozart. He couldn't see the sharks circling him. He could only hear their deceptive, polite chatter. Beatrice was playing the role of the perfect hostess, gliding through the crowd in a backless emerald green gown, charming the aldermen and placating the mob captains. Silas was never far from her orbit, his eyes constantly scanning the room, already acting as if he owned the empire. Clara, dressed in a frilly pink dress she absolutely despised, had been instructed by Beatrice to stay in the children's playroom upstairs with a nanny. But Clara was her father's daughter, and Arthur had taught her how to evade. She slipped out a side window, shimmied down a sturdy oak trellis, and re-entered the mansion through the catering kitchen doors. She navigated the crowded ballroom with the agility of a ghost. The towering adults, flush with liquor and arrogance, didn't even glance down. Clara weaved through a forest of tailored trousers and silk gowns until she reached the heavy velvet ropes guarding Dominic's alcove. One of the bodyguards, a hulking man named Paulie, stepped forward to block her. "Hey, kiddo," Paulie rumbled, recognizing her. "You ain't supposed to be down here. The boss is resting his eyes. It's too loud for him." "I just want to give Uncle Dom a hug good night," Clara pleaded, employing her most innocent, wide-eyed stare. "Please, Paulie. Just for 1 second. I had a bad dream." Paulie, a hardened killer with a surprising soft spot for Arthur's orphan, sighed and glanced around. Beatrice was on the other side of the room, deep in conversation with a judge. "All right, make it quick," Paulie muttered, lifting the velvet rope. 10 seconds, kid." Clara darted forward. Dominic sat rigidly in his chair, his hands resting on a silver-topped cane he had recently been forced to adopt. He looked tired, older than his 34 years, a king slowly being buried alive in a tomb of darkness. "Uncle Dom?" Clara whispered, placing a small warm hand over his large, cold knuckles. Dominic flinched slightly, then relaxed. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth for the first time that evening. "Clara, little bird, what are you doing down here in the shark tank? You should be asleep." Clara leaned in close. She knew she had only seconds before Paulie pulled her away, or Beatrice noticed her. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her head. She knew she couldn't explain the vial, the pantry, or Silas. It would take too long. He wouldn't believe it immediately. She had to deliver a shock to his system. She pressed her face against his ear, smelling his familiar scent of bergamot and expensive cigar smoke. She cupped her hand to shield her mouth from anyone watching. "You're not blind, Uncle Dom," Clara whispered rapidly, her small voice trembling with terrified urgency. "Your wife is spiking your food. The medicine is bad. Don't drink the coffee. She's making you blind on purpose." Dominic's entire body went rigid. It was as if a jolt of pure electricity had been injected straight into his spine. The air in his lungs vanished. "Clara, time's up. Back upstairs," Paulie said, stepping forward and gently but firmly grasping Clara's shoulder, pulling her away. "Good night, Uncle Dom," Clara said loudly, masking her panic. "I love you." "I love you too, little bird," Dominic managed to choke out, his voice a hoarse rasp. As Clara was escorted away, Dominic remained frozen in his chair. The string quartet, the clinking glasses, the hum of conversations, it all faded into a deafening roar of white noise inside his head. "You're not blind. Your wife is spiking your food." The words echoed in his skull, bouncing off the walls of his darkening mind. His first instinct was absolute denial. It was impossible. Beatrice was his rock. Beatrice loved him. Clara was just a child. She probably had a nightmare. She didn't understand adult medicine. But Dominic was a creature of the underworld. He had survived this long because he possessed a paranoid, feral instinct for survival. He began to run the data through his mind, the puzzle pieces he had ignored because he was too close, too blinded by love and fear. The onset of his blindness perfectly coincided with Beatrice returning from a spa retreat in South America. The doctor's absolute bafflement at his specific symptoms. The fact that the blindness seemed to accelerate on the days he stayed home, drinking Beatrice's bespoke teas and espressos, and plateaued on the rare days he travelled out of the city without her. And Silas. Silas's sudden, aggressive push to handle the syndicate's finances, supported completely by Beatrice. A cold, terrifying clarity washed over the Mafia boss. The fog in his eyes remained, but the fog in his mind instantly evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, murderous rage. He was Dominic Rossi. He built an empire on blood and cunning. He would not be slaughtered like a blind sheep in his own pen, but he couldn't react. Not yet. If Clara was right, and he reacted now, Beatrice and Silas would simply accelerate their timeline. A bullet to his head would be easier than slow poison. He needed proof. He needed to test the little bird's theory. "Poorly," Dominic said, his voice terrifyingly calm, completely devoid of the weakness he had shown for months. "Yeah, boss? Go find my wife. Tell her the noise is giving me a migraine. Tell her I wish to retire to my study and ask her to bring my evening espresso. I need my medicine." "Right away, boss." 10 minutes later, Dominic was seated in the familiar, leather-scented quiet of his private study. The heavy oak doors clicked open, and the soft rustle of silk announced Beatrice's arrival. The scent of her floral perfume filled the room, a scent that now made Dominic's stomach churn with revulsion. "My poor darling," Beatrice cooed, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. "The party was too much for you. I told Silas you shouldn't have pushed yourself." She walked behind his chair, her cool hands massaging his shoulders. He forced his muscles to remain relaxed, acting the part of the frail, dependent husband. "I brought your espresso, Dominic. I crushed your supplements into it, just the way you need it. Drink up. It will help you sleep." She placed the porcelain cup on the desk right in front of him. Dominic reached out, his hand trembling slightly, a theatrical touch he added for her benefit. He grasped the warm cup. "Thank you, my love," Dominic said softly. "What would I do without you?" "You'll never have to find out," Beatrice murmured, kissing the top of his head. "I have to get back to the guests, darling. Silas needs help with the mayor. Drink your medicine. I'll check on you in an hour. Go. Enjoy the night." He listened intently to the sound of her heels retreating. He waited for the heavy oak doors to click shut. He waited 10 more seconds, listening for any shift in the shadows. When he was certain he was alone, Dominic lifted the cup. He didn't bring it to his lips. Instead, he leaned over his desk, reached out blindly until his fingers brushed the large potted fern sitting by the window, and slowly, deliberately, poured the dark, poisoned liquid into the soil. He set the empty cup back on the saucer with a quiet clink. He sat back in the darkness, sightless, but finally seeing everything. The war had just begun, and the Don of Chicago was awake. For the next 14 days, the sprawling Lake Forest estate became a stage, and Dominic Rossi was executing the most critical, agonizing performance of his life. To the outside world, the Don of Chicago was accelerating toward his tragic, inevitable end. He allowed his shoulders to slump. He began to drag his right foot slightly, feigning the neurological deterioration the corrupted doctors had predicted. He ordered the heavy velvet curtains in his study to be drawn at all times, claiming the ambient light caused him blinding migraines. In reality, the darkness was his sanctuary. Every evening at 8 o'clock, the ritual played out with nauseating predictability. Beatrice would sweep into the room, wrapped in the scent of her expensive Parisian perfume and the cloying warmth of a devoted wife. She would deliver the steaming porcelain cup of espresso, laced with the invisible venom designed to steal his empire. Dominic would smile, his unseeing eyes aimed vaguely in her direction, and thank her with practiced, hollow affection. The moment the heavy oak doors clicked shut, the performance ended. Dominic would rise silently from his leather armchair, cross the room with the memory of a predator, and pour the dark liquid into the soil of the large imported Boston fern situated by the bay window. The proof of Clara's terrifying warning did not come from a medical chart, but from the plant. By the 5th day, the vibrant green fronds of the fern began to curl inward, turning a sickly, jaundiced yellow. By the 10th day, the plant was entirely dead, its brittle leaves dropping to the hardwood floor like dry ash. It was a stark, horrifying visual representation of what the neurotoxin was doing to his brain and optic nerves. Beatrice and Silas weren't just blinding him, they were fundamentally destroying his nervous system. To survive the physical toll of withdrawal and starvation, since he could no longer trust any meal prepared in the estate's kitchen, Dominic needed an accomplice. He chose Paulie. The hulking bodyguard was a man of simple, brutal loyalties. He didn't care about syndicate politics or offshore accounts. He cared about the man who had paid for his mother's cancer treatments 10 years ago. Dominic cornered Paulie in the soundproofed armory in the estate's basement. Paulie, Dominic had said, keeping his eyes fixed on the blank wall to maintain the illusion, but lowering his voice to a deadly, commanding register. I need you to listen to me, and I need you to forget everything you think you know about my condition. When Dominic explained his suspicions, Paulie's massive hands had balled into fists, his knuckles turning white. The bodyguard was ready to march upstairs and snap Silas's neck on the spot, but Dominic forbade it. A quick death was far too merciful for this level of betrayal. Furthermore, Silas commanded the loyalty of 3 of the 5 city capos. If Dominic moved without irrefutable proof, it would trigger a bloody civil war that would tear the Rossi syndicate to ashes. Instead, Paulie became Dominic's lifeline. He began smuggling high-calorie protein bars, beef jerky, and sealed bottles of water into the estate hidden inside hollowed-out ammunition crates. Dominic sustained himself in secret, his body slowly purging the heavy metals and synthesized toxins Beatrice had been feeding him. The true miracle, however, occurred on the morning of the 14th day. Dominic awoke in his master suite. Beatrice was already gone, having moved into a separate bedroom months ago under the guise of allowing him undisturbed rest. Dominic lay still, staring up at the ceiling. For 8 months, waking up meant opening his eyes to a suffocating, impenetrable wall of charcoal-grey static. But this morning was different. He blinked. The grey static was still there, but it was no longer a solid wall. It was breaking apart, fracturing like thin ice on a winter lake. Through the cracks in the fog, he perceived something he hadn't seen in nearly a year. Light. It was just a faint, hazy glow filtering through the edges of the blackout curtains, but to Dominic, it was brighter than a supernova. He slowly lifted his right hand and held it inches from his face. He couldn't see the lines on his palm, but he could clearly distinguish the solid, dark silhouette of his own fingers moving against the lighter background of the room. A ragged, choking breath escaped his chest. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eye sockets, his massive shoulders shaking as a single, silent tear carved a path down his cheek. He was not a man prone to emotion. His heart was built for the cold calculations of the underworld, but the return of his sight was a resurrection. Clara, the tiny, forgotten ghost of the mansion, had saved his life. The venom was leaving his system. The irreversible optical decay was reversing. He was a dead man crawling out of his own grave, and he was bringing hellfire with him. But the victory was laced with a chilling realization. His returning sight meant he could no longer hide behind the bliss of genuine ignorance. He was about to see the betrayal with his own 2 eyes, and he had to summon every ounce of his legendary discipline to pretend he was still completely, hopelessly blind. As the weeks bled into a month, Dominic's vision rapidly improved, from hazy silhouettes to blurry, color-washed shapes, and finally to sharp, functional clarity. He secretly procured a pair of heavy, dark-tinted sunglasses, claiming his eyes had developed a painful photosensitivity. The glasses served a dual purpose. They hid the returning focus and tracking movements of his pupils, and they allowed him to observe his enemies from behind a darkened veil. The Rossi estate transformed into a psychological torture chamber. To walk through his own home and witness the blatant disrespect, the silent mockeries, and the arrogant theft of his legacy required a superhuman level of restraint. He saw his trusted lieutenants rolling their eyes when he issued orders. He saw the maids pocketing silver trinkets from the hallways, assuming the blind Don would never notice the missing inventory. But the most excruciating agony was reserved for his observations of his wife and his underboss. Beatrice and Silas had grown perilously comfortable in their deception. They believed Dominic was entirely confined to a world of darkness, essentially a piece of breathing furniture. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, the true depth of their depravity was laid bare. Dominic was seated behind his mahogany desk, reviewing a braille ledger he no longer actually needed to read. Silas and Beatrice were in the room, supposedly updating him on the Southside shipping manifests. "The union leaders are demanding a 10% increase on the waterfront, Dom," Silas said, his voice projecting across the room. "I told them to walk, but they're threatening to strike." Dominic kept his face perfectly impassive, his eyes fixed on the empty space above his desk. "Offer them 5%, Silas. We can't afford a strike while the feds are sniffing around the ports." "Whatever you say, boss," Silas replied. Behind the dark lenses of his sunglasses, Dominic's eyes tracked Silas's movements. The underboss wasn't looking at Dominic. He was standing by the antique liquor cabinet, pouring himself a generous measure of Dominic's prized 50-year-old Macallan Scotch, a bottle strictly reserved for the Don. Worse still, Beatrice was standing right beside Silas. As Silas brought the crystal tumbler to his lips, Beatrice reached out and casually, intimately, adjusted the lapel of Silas's suit jacket. She smiled up at him, a genuine, wicked, hungry smile that she hadn't directed at Dominic in years. Silas smirked, set the glass down, and leaned in. Right there, not 20 feet from where Dominic sat, his wife and his underboss locked lips. It was a slow, deliberate, deeply intimate kiss, fueled by the intoxicating thrill of committing treason right in front of the king. Dominic's hands, resting flat on the mahogany desk, flexed. Beneath the lip of the desk, securely taped to the wood, was a loaded Glock 19. All it would take was a flick of his wrist. He could draw, rack the slide, and put a hollow-point bullet through Silas's forehead and another through Beatrice's treacherous heart before either of them could even gasp. His blood screamed for violence, The primal Sicilian code of omerta and vengeance demanded immediate execution. But Dominic Rossi was not a street thug. He was a master chess player, and shooting them now would leave the game unfinished. If he killed them in his study, the capos loyal to Silas would retaliate. The financial web Beatrice had secretly spun to drain his accounts would remain tangled. He didn't just want them dead. He wanted them ruined, exposed, and stripped of everything they had tried to steal from him. He forced his hands to relax. He took a slow, measured breath. "Is it raining again, Beatrice?" Dominic asked, his voice mild and perfectly conversational, shattering the silence in the room. Beatrice and Silas broke apart instantly, jumping like startled thieves. Silas hastily wiped his mouth, his eyes darting toward Dominic with a flash of panic, before realizing that Don's gaze was still fixed blankly forward. Beatrice cleared her throat, smoothing down her silk skirt. "Yes, darling. It just started pouring. Let me close the window for you. The dampness isn't good for your joints." "Thank you, my love. You always take such good care of me," Dominic said, tasting the metallic tang of blood in his mouth from biting the inside of his cheek to stop himself from screaming. When they finally left the study, Dominic locked the heavy doors. He pulled the dark glasses from his face and walked over to the antique liquor cabinet. He stared at the crystal tumbler Silas had used, still bearing the faint smudge of Beatrice's lipstick on the rim. He picked it up and shattered it against the stone fireplace. The war was no longer abstract. It was visceral, and it was deeply personal. He needed to map out the exact architecture of their coup. While he pretended to sleep through the night, Dominic was actually wide awake, using a tiny, low-lumen penlight to scour the estate. He picked the locks on Beatrice's private filing cabinets. He bypassed the encryption on Silas's laptop, using backdoor codes he had purchased years ago and never admitted to possessing. The paper trail was a masterpiece of corporate theft. Beatrice had been steadily transferring millions of dollars from the syndicate's legitimate construction fronts into offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands, companies registered under Silas's aliases. They were bleeding the Rossi empire dry, preparing a golden parachute for the moment they finally decided to put Dominic in the ground. But Dominic couldn't be everywhere. He couldn't monitor Beatrice during the day when she attended her high society luncheons, and he couldn't tail Silas when he met with the rival factions to negotiate the division of Dominic's territory. He needed an operative who could move through the world entirely unnoticed. He needed his little bird. He arranged the meeting with absolute precision. He knew Clara spent her Tuesday afternoons in the estate's sprawling, glass-domed greenhouse, reading books among the rare orchids while her tutors took their lunch break. Dominic slipped out the side door of his study, tapping his silver cane against the stone pathways, playing the role of the blind man taking a melancholy stroll. When he entered the humid, earth-scented air of the greenhouse, he waited until he was deep within the dense foliage of the tropical section before he stopped tapping the cane. "Clara," he whispered softly. There was a rustle of leaves, and the 7-year-old girl emerged from behind a massive monstera plant, clutching a worn copy of Treasure Island. Her large, dark eyes widened in surprise. "Uncle Dom?" she asked hesitantly. "You're walking by yourself? Where is Paulie?" Dominic knelt down on the damp slate floor, ignoring the dirt staining his custom-tailored trousers. He pulled off the dark sunglasses and looked directly into her eyes. He didn't stare past her. He focused sharply on her face, taking in the small freckles across her nose and the intelligent spark in her gaze. Clara gasped, dropping her book. "You're looking at me. You can see me." "Because of you, little bird," Dominic said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. "You were right about everything, and because you were brave enough to tell me the truth, I stopped drinking the poison. The shadows are gone." Clara threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. Dominic held her tightly, closing his eyes as a wave of fierce, paternal protectiveness washed over him. Arthur had died to save Dominic's life, and now Arthur's daughter had saved him again. He would burn the city to the ground before he let anyone harm a single hair on her head. "Why are you still pretending?" Clara whispered, pulling back to look at him, her young mind quickly grasping the danger of the situation. "Why don't you call the police, or your scary friends?" "Because if I do that now, the bad people will run away, and they will take everything that belongs to our family," Dominic explained gently, speaking to her not as a child, but as a trusted soldier. "I have to catch them in a trap, but I need your help, Clara. I need you to do something very dangerous, and you have to promise me you will be careful." Clara nodded solemnly, her small face setting into a mask of grim determination that reminded Dominic painfully of her father. "I promise, Uncle Dom. What do you need me to do?" "Beatrice hides the poison somewhere in her bedroom or her private bathroom," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I can't go in there without her knowing. I need you to find the vial. Don't touch it. Don't take it. Just find out exactly where she keeps it hidden. If I know where it is, I can replace it with something harmless. And then we set the trap." "I'll find it," Clara stated, her voice devoid of fear. She was a child of the Mafia. She understood the stakes. She won't even know I was there. "Good girl," Dominic said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "We are going to take our house back, Clara. I promise you." As Dominic replaced his sunglasses and began tapping his cane back towards the main mansion, the pieces of his grand, bloody finale were falling into place. The blind Don was dead. The wolf was awake, and he was hungry. The sprawling Rossi estate was a fortress built to keep enemies out, but its heavily guarded walls were utterly useless against the phantom already living inside. Clara knew Beatrice's schedule with the precise calculation of a seasoned spy. Every Wednesday, at exactly 2 in the afternoon, Beatrice spent 90 minutes in her private, marble-tiled ensuite bathroom, indulging in a lavish skincare routine accompanied by loud classical music. It was the only window of absolute, unobserved vulnerability the mob wife allowed herself. Clara slipped into the master wing, her stockinged feet making absolutely no sound on the thick Persian runner. The heavy mahogany door to Beatrice's bedroom was unlocked. Clara pushed it open just enough to squeeze her small frame through, the booming crescendo of a Vivaldi concerto instantly confirming that Beatrice was occupied. The bedroom was a monument to cold, untouchable luxury. Silk drapes, imported Italian furniture, and the overpowering scent of dried lavender and expensive face creams. Clara didn't waste a second. She began a systematic search of the places a child knows to look. Under the heavy mattress, behind the massive gilded mirrors, inside the velvet-lined jewelry boxes sitting on the vanity. Nothing. Panic began to flutter in Clara's chest like a trapped moth. The music swelled, signaling she was running out of time. She moved to the massive walk-in closet, scanning rows of designer shoes and sable coats. Her eyes caught something unusual on the top shelf of a shoe rack, a vintage crystal perfume bottle, sitting entirely alone, pushed far back into the shadows behind a row of winter boots. It was out of place. Beatrice was a woman who displayed her wealth. She didn't hide vintage Chanel behind leather boots. Clara dragged a velvet stool over, climbed up, and reached for the bottle. It was surprisingly heavy. As her small fingers grasped the crystal stopper, she realized it wasn't a stopper at all, but a cleverly disguised screw-top lid. She twisted it, pulling out a hidden glass cylinder suspended inside the hollowed-out perfume bottle. Inside the cylinder was the clear, odorless liquid, the venom. She committed the hiding spot to memory, carefully replaced the bottle exactly as she had found it, and practically flew out of the room just as the bathroom water shut off. That night, under the cover of a simulated migraine, Dominic summoned Paulie to his study. The hulking bodyguard listened intently as Dominic relayed Clara's discovery. "Tonight, at 3 in the morning, Beatrice will be asleep," Dominic ordered. his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "You will bypass her door alarm. You will take this." He slid a small glass vial across his desk. "It's distilled water mixed with a harmless, bitter, botanical extract to mimic the taste. Swap it with the liquid in the perfume bottle. Bring me the poison." "Consider it done, boss," Paulie grunted, pocketing the decoy vial. The swap was executed flawlessly. When Paulie returned to the basement armory the next morning and handed Dominic the real neurotoxin, the Don of Chicago felt a chilling sense of finality. He held the weapon that was meant to slowly erase him from the world. He locked the vial in a biometric safe hidden behind a false brick in the armory wall. The physical threat was neutralized, but the political trap was just beginning to take shape. Dominic knew Silas and Beatrice were growing impatient. His miraculous plateau in symptoms, thanks to drinking the decoy water, was throwing off their timeline. They couldn't wait for him to waste away entirely. They needed a decisive transfer of power. His suspicions were confirmed 3 days later when Silas walked into the study, flanked by Beatrice. Dominic sat in his chair, wearing his dark glasses, staring blankly at the wall. "Dom, we need to talk about the future," Silas said, dropping a thick leather binder onto the desk. The thud echoed ominously. "The families in New York and Vegas are getting nervous. They hear whispers that you're incapacitated. The shipments are slowing down because our partners lack confidence in a vulnerable leader." "What are you suggesting, Silas?" Dominic asked mildly, letting a tremor of feigned weakness seep into his voice. Beatrice stepped forward, resting a hand on Dominic's shoulder. "Dominic, darling, it breaks my heart. But Silas is right. The syndicate needs a visible, strong hand at the wheel. Just temporarily, of course, until the doctors find a miracle." "The binder contains a formal transfer of authority," Silas explained smoothly, already tasting the victory. "It grants me full proxy control over the Rossi Syndicate's assets, territories, and bank accounts. It's for the good of the family, Dom. You sign this, and you can focus entirely on your health." Behind the dark lenses, Dominic's eyes traced the smug, arrogant lines of Silas's face. He looked at Beatrice, noting the subtle flush of excitement on her cheeks. They thought they had won. They thought they had outsmarted the devil in his own house. "If it is for the good of the family," Dominic whispered, letting his head droop in a masterclass of defeated resignation, "then I will sign it. But a transition of this magnitude cannot be done in secret. Call the 5 captains. Lorenzo, Carmine, all of them. Assemble them in the grand dining room tomorrow night. I will sign the proxy in front of the high table so there is no dispute." Silas and Beatrice exchanged a quick, triumphant glance. This was better than they had hoped. A public abdication would cement Silas's rule permanently. "I'll make the calls, boss," Silas said, unable to hide the smirk in his voice. "Tomorrow night." When they left, Dominic removed his glasses. He picked up his secure, encrypted burner phone, a device Silas knew nothing about, and dialed a number he hadn't called in 8 months. "Lorenzo," Dominic spoke into the receiver, his voice devoid of any weakness, ringing with the terrifying, absolute authority of the Don. "Listen to me very carefully. The blind man is going to see tomorrow night, and the rats are going to bleed." The atmosphere in the grand dining room the following evening was suffocatingly tense. The 5 capos of the Rossi Syndicate, hardened, dangerous men who controlled the illegal lifeblood of the city, sat around the massive mahogany table. Lorenzo Moretti and Carmine Falcone, Dominic's oldest and most lethal commanders, sat near the head of the table, their faces carved from stone. Silas stood at the head of the room, looking every bit the newly crowned king in a tailored, midnight blue suit. Beatrice was seated gracefully to his right, playing the role of the tragic, supportive queen. The heavy double doors opened, and Dominic entered. The room fell dead silent. He leaned heavily on his silver-topped cane, flanked by Paulie. He wore his dark glasses, his head tilted slightly as if listening for obstacles. Paulie guided him to the large, ornate chair at the opposite end of the table from Silas. "Gentlemen," Silas announced, his voice booming with artificial authority. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. As you all know, our beloved Don has been battling a tragic illness. To ensure the strength and continuity of our operations, Dominic has decided to officially transfer proxy leadership to me. The documents are prepared." Silas slid the leather binder down the long, polished length of the table. It came to a stop directly in front of Dominic. Beatrice stood up, carrying a gold Mont Blanc pen. She walked the length of the table, her heels clicking like a metronome, counting down Dominic's final seconds of power. She placed the pen gently into Dominic's right hand. "Here, my love, right at the bottom of the page. I'll guide your hand." Dominic did not move. He sat perfectly still, holding the heavy gold pen. The silence in the room stretched, becoming fragile, ready to snap. "Dom?" Silas prompted, a hint of nervous irritation creeping into his voice. "Sign the paper." Dominic slowly raised his left hand. He grasped the frames of his dark glasses. In one smooth, deliberate motion, he pulled them off and placed them on the table. He didn't stare blankly ahead. He didn't blink unseeingly. He lifted his chin, and his piercing, dark eyes locked directly onto Silas's face with terrifying, razor-sharp focus. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Carmine and Lorenzo didn't move a muscle, but the other three capos went rigid in their chairs. Beatrice froze, her hand still hovering over the document, the blood draining from her beautiful face until she looked like a porcelain corpse. "I have a confession to make to the table," Dominic said. His voice was no longer a weak rasp. It was a booming, resonant baritone that commanded the air in the room. "For 8 months, I have been living in the dark. I trusted the people closest to me to guide me through that darkness. But instead, they used it to dig my grave. Dom, what is this?" Silas stammered, taking a step back, his eyes darting frantically towards the door. "Sit down, Silas," Dominic commanded, his eyes blazing with hellfire. Silas didn't sit. He reached inside his tailored jacket for his weapon. He didn't even clear leather. Paulie was already moving, drawing his customized Sig Sauer and leveling it directly at Silas's chest. Simultaneously, Lorenzo and Carmine drew their weapons, aiming them at the three capos loyal to Silas, silently daring them to intervene. Nobody moved. The rebellion was crushed before it could even draw breath. "You thought I was blind," Dominic said, standing up. He didn't need the cane. He kicked it aside. It clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. "You thought I couldn't see you pouring venom into my espresso. You thought I couldn't see you siphoning millions from the construction fronts into the Cayman accounts. You thought I couldn't see you." He turned his head slowly, locking eyes with his terrified wife, kissing my underboss in my own study. Beatrice choked out a sob, stumbling backward until she hit the wall. "Dominic, please, it's a mistake. He forced me. Silas forced me to do it." "Liar!" Silas spat, his composure entirely shattered. "It was her idea. She procured the toxin. She said you were making us weak." "Enough," Dominic roared, slamming his fist onto the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. He reached into his pocket and tossed the small, clear vial of neurotoxin onto the leather binder. It rolled and came to a stop against the gold pen. "This is the weapon you chose," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper as he began a slow walk toward Silas. "A coward's weapon. You didn't have the stomach to look me in the eye and take my throne like a man. You tried to steal it in the shadows." Dominic stopped directly in front of Silas. The underboss was trembling, sweat beading on his forehead, Paulie's gun still trained unwaveringly on his heart. "In our world, treason is paid in blood," Dominic stated coldly. "But death is too fast for what you did to me." Dominic turned to Lorenzo. "Strip him of everything. Liquidate his accounts, burn his properties, and put out a black contract on his name. Silas doesn't die tonight. He lives, but he lives knowing that every syndicate from Chicago to Palermo has $1 million bounty on his head. Throw him on the street with nothing but the clothes on his back. Let him run. Let the paranoia eat him alive, just like he tried to eat my mind." Paulie grabbed Silas roughly by the collar, dragging the weeping, broken man out of the grand dining room. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing Silas's fate. Dominic slowly turned his attention to Beatrice. She was sliding down the wall, her emerald gown pooling around her on the floor, weeping hysterically. "And you," Dominic said, walking over and looking down at the woman he had once loved with everything he had. "You will be escorted to a private, heavily guarded estate in northern Alaska. You will have no phone, no internet, and no contact with the outside world. You wanted me to live in isolation and darkness, Beatrice. Now it is your turn to experience it, forever." He snapped his fingers, and two of Lorenzo's men stepped forward, pulling Beatrice to her feet and dragging her, screaming, from the room. Dominic stood alone at the head of the table. He looked at the remaining capos. They were pale, sweating, fully realizing how close they had come to backing the wrong side. "The king is not blind," Dominic Rossi said softly, yet his voice carried to every corner of the room. "The king sees everything. The meeting is adjourned." Hours later, the estate was quiet again. The traitors were gone. The loyalties were cemented in absolute terror and respect, and the Rossi syndicate was stronger than ever. Dominic walked upstairs to the guest wing. He gently pushed open the door to Clara's room. The little girl was fast asleep, clutching her book, bathed in the soft, warm light of a bedside lamp. Dominic sat on the edge of the mattress, careful not to wake her. He reached out and gently brushed a stray curl from her forehead. His vision was perfect, crystal clear. But as he looked at the brave little girl who had saved an empire with a whisper, his eyes blurred once more, this time with tears of profound gratitude. He was Dominic Rossi, the most ruthless Don in Chicago. But to Clara, he would always be the giant who kept the monsters away. The darkness was finally defeated, and the dawn had never looked so beautiful. Betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from the hands you trust to guide you through the dark. Dominic Rossi's terrifying journey from a helpless, poisoned king to a resurrected, vengeful Don proves that the greatest threats aren't always the rival families at the gates, but the smiling faces pouring your coffee. The chilling silence of his wife's deception was completely unraveled by the innocence of a child, reminding us that truth can hide in the most unexpected places. Clara didn't just save a man's sight, she saved an empire from rotting from the inside out. If this intense tale of mafia treachery, calculated revenge, and unbreakable loyalty kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share it with your fellow drama lovers. Subscribe to the channel for more gripping, cinematic stories, and let me know in the comments, what would you have done if you discovered the person you loved was secretly poisoning you? See you in the next video.